Otherwise, we might start without him and let the panel be on auto panel. I could, but I think he must be on his way. He was away and was arriving this morning, I think. So he may be on his way. It's 11:45, so we won't actually take more time. Let's just start. Again, no introductions. Neelkanth, Mishra and Prateek Singh have done a wonderful paper and a big labor of love on assembling state-level data on state finances. It's part of an ongoing three-year commitment to, or now 3 years into this, perhaps has the best state-level data of any organization, but in a very public-minded way is very happy to share it with the larger community. And indeed, if you are a subscriber to his email, he's already sent out an email to his own subscriber list describing some of the salient points of this data. So this is real-time dissemination that's happening beyond just the IPF. So Neelkanth Mishra and Prateek Singh, and then we have two very knowledgeable and eminent discussants, Indira Rajaraman, 13th Finance Commission, and a number of other institutional affiliations, and Rathin Roy, currently the director of an IPFP, and members of various commissions as well, including in his last stint, the 7th Pay Commission. So, Neelkanth, and 30 minutes, and then discussants.
Super. Excellent. Good morning, everyone. And Shekhar, thank you for getting us here. We are not very used to academic research. The burden of proof in the domain where we work is actually much lighter. So as was discussed by Arvind as well in the morning, our kind sort of latches onto themes very quickly, and we work. I mean, speed is preferred over accuracy. In this case, I've gone back to my roots of 20 years back, and where I used to do work on artificial intelligence, where at least tried to bring some academic rigor into it. So hopefully, I'll stand up to it. The way we will do it is I've broken it up into three sections. There in the state budgets, as you can expect, there is a lot to cover. There is a lot of nuance that can be brought on. We are a country, we are a sixth of humanity. Clearly, there is a lot going on in the states. So we have bundled it together into three segments. The first is to highlight why state governments should be analyzed, and I'm continuing to be surprised that the research on state budgets is actually so limited. We will, in the second section, look at some of the trends and patterns that we can see. The objective is not to do a comprehensive study here. I mean, you can't do that in 30 minutes, and neither can you do that in a 30-page paper. But the objective was to look at some salient things that we could bring out. Thirdly, there are big changes happening in the ecosystem. So there is GST coming up, which subsumes nearly 40% of what the state's own tax base is. There is also this issue of farm loan waivers, which in my view, in our view, Prateek, in our view, we don't think this is a one-year problem. This is something that is going to keep hitting us in the coming years. But nevertheless, at least our view is that we wouldn't like to be too worried about it. I mean, it's something that will get fiscally phased out over many years. And thirdly, there is the FRBM Review Committee recommendations. And there are issues of how to get the states to adhere to it, or to even pass legislation for it. But we'll discuss that. So quickly jumping into it. See the left, so we like charts, right? Because our investor base, our reader base generally has an attention span of 3-year-olds. So we like to put it in charts, right? Simple, no text. So you see the left-hand side chart here. The blue line is the state expenditures year on year. The adjustment we have made here for the central government expenditure is that if the center is transferring money to the states, we net it off. So that is discretion that the center does not really have. Earlier, even in that transfer, the center used to have some discretion based on which schemes, which policy they were trying to push, but increasingly even that has gone down, so we net it off. The right-hand side chart is perhaps the most powerful I've ever made in my career as an analyst, which is the green line that you can see. You see it's snaking up very, very sharply. It is, so the center, or the states put together now spend 87% more than the center, right? So there is a complete media circus around the central budget. You try to find out data on the UP budget, which is now being discussed, and you'll find almost nothing, right? And UP spends 20% as much as the center. So, so the states put together will be spending almost 30 trillion rupees, 30 lakh crores, which is nearly 20% of GDP. So they matter. They matter a lot. They used to matter a lot less in FY11 when they spent only 6% more than the center. But you can see, courtesy the 14th Finance Commission, that number has risen very sharply. The second thing is that the surge in transfers is actually behind us. So, so the year-on-year growth in expenditure, the black line on the left-hand side chart, is you could see it was, in the high teens, perhaps more than 20% in 1 year. But in FY18B, this number falls to less than 10%. So we are seeing a sharp slowdown. It is driven by, if you see the right-hand side chart, the color coding there is blue is their own taxes, red is central transfers, the gray is their fiscal deficit. So, so as the state, as the nominal GDP keeps expanding at 12 to 14% in India, your fiscal deficit ratio stays the same, so you get more fiscal space, right? So it's very simple. So you can see that the central transfers, the growth in central transfers is shrinking. This is partly because center's own tax rate, tax collection growth is slowing down. The last couple of years there was a big surge because of excise duties on petroleum. They were raising taxes on service tax, and we will discuss GST shortly. But so that is slowing down, and that is why the state's aggregate spending growth is slowing down. As you can expect, the slowdown is much worse in states where there is a lot more dependence on central transfers. So Bihar, UP, these are states which are seeing a much sharper slowing in their expenditure. But that is only part of the picture. What has been fascinating is that the states, and so you see the left hand side chart, the red line that you see is tax to GDP for the states. So the states have actually been doing a lot of work in increasing their taxation as well. So about a third, so between FY11 and FY18, right? FY11 was the base, I mean, where central state spending was 6% higher than the centers. So from there to the last 7 years, there's been a 19 lakh crores of additional spending that states have done. About a third of that has been funded through their own taxes. So, so it is not just the 14th Finance Commission that they're making merry on. They have actually been raising their tax collections as well. It has stagnated a bit in the last couple of years, but it is quite healthy. What is also interesting and important is that they are actually still being very lazy. So the scope for improvement is quite significant. So you can see that 60% is the right-hand pie chart. This is the split of their own taxes. 12% is property taxes, 12% is state excise, which is effectively tax on alcohol. 60% is sales tax. What is even more interesting is that 40% of VAT collections, sales tax collections, come from petroleum products and alcohol, which is why they've been so reluctant to get them into GST, because they lose a lot more of flexibility. So there is much more scope for them to expand their taxes, especially as the red line that you see on the left hand side is the share of non-VAT taxes in their total tax collection. And you can see it has been falling since 1991. And for those of you sitting in the back, the chart starts at 1991 towards the left, and you can see it has been falling. So there is some cyclicality. There is property taxes, etc., which are by nature cyclical, real estate, etc. But there is a trend here, and which shows that the states have actually been lax in using other revenue sources than VAT, and they need to be more creative. What you see on the right hand side chart, it's a bit complex, but let me explain. So the top 5 states are 42% of our population. Top 10 states are 65% of the population. So the gray are top 5, blue are top 10. For VAT, top 5 is 47% of total tax, top 10 is 72. But for the non-VAT taxes, the concentration is much higher. which means that not only are non-VAT taxes declining in importance, they are also concentrated in very few states, which means that there are a lot of other states which can actually do a much better job in collecting more taxes. My view is, and this is something based on my reading of what happened in China. So, periodically, what the Chinese central government does or has done is that they, once a tax becomes very important, they've appropriated that to the center, and then the provinces are then forced to start innovating and collecting more taxes. This is not necessarily negative. I mean, anyone in my domain, more tax is bad. I don't think so. I mean, it's like, the principle of taxation where it's like, bees getting honey from flowers. I mean, from that perspective, there are creative ways of taxation, given that our tax to GDP is among the lowest in the world, that states should be pushed into. And very likely, the perceived loss of freedom under GST is actually going to push them into doing that. What has also been happening is that the non-VAT, non-tax revenues contribution has also been falling. So you see that it seems to be an over-reliance on VAT, right, in aggregate. So in terms of taxation from mining, from petroleum products, the states have actually been very lax, and perhaps the issue of GST or even land sales. Telangana experimented with it last year. They booked almost 11,000 crores in the budget. They missed it by 8,000 crores. So the problem was that there was litigation. So you can see that some of the more adventurous states are experimenting here, and these are new experiments. I mean, the advantage of doing it for the third year in running is that you can start to see some patterns now, but it is still, I think, very, very primitive. I think we need to see a lot more of experimentation on the non-tax side as well. Now we come to what is a pet peeve in my side of the world, which is in the markets, people are excessively worried about state budgets, state deficits shooting up, right? Which is, if you see the right-hand side chart, that is the red line is the aggregate headline deficit. You can see the numbers did go up a lot, right? So they are very worried. My point is that if you start, and everyone starts in FY11 and FY12 as the comparison. Well, that was the lowest among the lowest we've ever recorded. So that's a very inappropriate starting point. Most states are at or below the limit specified for them. If you remove Uday, and for those of you, I guess everyone here would be familiar with Uday, that was the SEB loan restructuring that happened in the last 2 years, where the states were given a special permission to expand their deficits beyond the 3% limit. So if you adjust for that and you see the twiggle, the blue twiggle on the right hand side chart, you can see that the state deficits have been in the 2.5 to 2.7% range. So they are up from FY11, but they are well within the limit, right? What has happened is that aggregate deficit, which is the left hand side chart, aggregate deficits have been falling. I mean, if you remove the two red stacked columns from those 2 years, the trend has been down. Now, the center's decline is, of course, quite credit worthy, and it has been quite extreme. But I think that it is not that the states are undoing all of that. We are actually, what we are seeing is that we are going to the 2002-2003 situation or the target where center and state were supposed to have 3% as fiscal deficit, right? We are now heading towards that domain. It is just that the center had violated and breached it a lot more. It had gone to 6.5, and it is now coming down to 3. And everyone is getting, this is something that we should have expected, but we are just not comfortable with the states being as large as the center. And we'll see that in the next chart as well. The left-hand side chart, the red line that you see, is the ratio of state government bond issuance to the central government bond issuance. So now states issue 80%, almost 80% as much of the bonds that the central government issues. And this is something that the bond markets are not used to. And unfortunately, most of the forward-looking research is actually done by people in the financial markets. And let me not criticize them too openly. But the point is that this should have been expected. I'm surprised it was not expected. But again, this is not something that I would extrapolate. Financial markets are very, very prone to extrapolation. If you see a line going like this, you pretty much expect it will be extrapolated in the next. And that is, I think, the problem with what is happening there. But our research shows that FY18B, the growth in state bond issuance is actually going to slow down as well. So this is not something that I would unnecessarily panic about. What is also happening, and which is quite healthy, is that a larger and larger percentage of the state deficits is being funded through bond issuance, which infuses market discipline and is actually much better instead of sort of them poking into small savings and etc. So all of that adjustment has been happening. So I'm not panicking about it, is I think the more important thing. What is increasing the distortion is the fact that the calendar of state borrowing is not properly controlled. See, if you see you see the left hand side chart, this is the quarterly borrowing by state governments. You can see in every year the borrowings are second half, if not fourth quarter focused, right? So almost all the borrowing is loaded into the last 4 months. This bond market is not very comfortable with this, because they get shocked, because generally they're not doing these numbers, they're not prepared that states are sort of going to keep growing, center is not growing, and they get surprised. The center is used to being the big daddy in the bond market, right? So or in the financial system. So they schedule their borrowing as 60-40, 60 first half, 40 second half. So you can see that the center, and this is the first half to second half. The gray is the first half, blue is the second half. Center does 60-40. States actually do 40-60, because that is their demand, that has been their need. And in the last year it was 35-65, which is terrible, right? And so what is happening is that aggregate bond issuance, and that therefore the downward sloping oval that you see there, that aggregate government borrowing is becoming more second half focused. And why is that important? Because credit growth in the system from the private sector picks up in the second half. So I think the regulators are also behind the curve. It's not just the bond market in terms of schedule. And this is something that I've been bringing up with RBI and the government for a while now, nearly 2 years. But hopefully, with repetition, the message will go home that that the state borrowing needs to be scheduled much better in order for it to be less disruptive. Moving to expenditure trends and patterns, there is a bias. The first thing I want to address, and this was actually the previous session sort of underlined this in a small way, that the assumption most of us make, and it's a very copy paste of a very Western philosophy, is that capex is good, revenue expenditure is bad. Now, what I would like to show in the next 1 or 2 charts is that that is not necessarily the case. I mean, I understand why that those views are there, but in India's case, perhaps more revenue expenditure is not that bad. Nevertheless, capex is as a percentage is now among the highest we have seen. It is falling this year, but it is still 17-20%. What you see on the right hand side chart, the dots are the capex share, and so you can see it is all over the place. There are states like Kerala where it is actually much less than 10%, and there are states like Telangana where 25% of expenditure is on capex. Some of this is triggered by the leeway given by the central government, that if your debt to GDP is below a certain threshold, if your interest costs are less than 10% of expenditure, you are a revenue surplus state, you can actually add 0.5% to your fiscal deficit. So there are 5 states in India where the fiscal deficit ratio is 3.5, and all of that extra 0.5 is being spent on capex. So states like MP, Orissa, Telangana are actually spending a lot more. So this is a very volatile number. What is interesting, and this is something that Karthik pointed out, don't draw causality, and I'll not draw causality, but I find it fascinating that so the left hand side chart, the way to read it is the gray bars are state employees per 1,000 people, right? This is the size of the state, so to say. The red dots are GSDP per capita, right? What you see is that most states who have below average, or on the right hand side of the chart in terms of a small government, actually have below average per capita GDP. I mean, there's no way you can dispute that, right? So I'm not drawing causality that you need a large state for the GSDP to go up, but there is a certain basic size which is needed for every state government, below which it becomes dysfunctional. Now, you can question whether the direction of causality here is from richer states having more taxes and therefore having more employees, or is it that they have more employees, therefore they have more GDP and therefore more taxes. To counter that, I have put police density. So the average police density in India is 1.38. So it's a phrase I've coined, so pardon me for that. What I'm saying is number of police people per 1,000 population. It's 1.38 in India. In states, in countries like Canada and Japan, and I'm deliberately not using US, the number is 2. So despite being much better equipped with smartphones and cars and guns and tasers and all of that, they actually have 50% more police people than us. Bihar and UP, so Bihar is at 0.7, UP is at 1. Right? So these are under police states. If you don't have law and order, you can't have growth. So there is a certain, and this is, I think, a very important policy bias that I think we must counter, that hiring people is bad. Right? I mean, hiring people in the wrong places is bad, but there are places like we saw on the Pollution Control Board. I think it's important to staff appropriately, and undersized governments can be very unproductive. Nevertheless, one concern that has emerged with all the central transfers that have been happening is that are we losing focus on the social side? And what you see on the left hand and the right hand side charts, the left hand side chart is the education revenue spent by states, and the red line is as a percentage of GDP. You can see, of course, Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan has helped. So we are now at 2.9%, nearly 3 lakh crores being spent, 5 lakh crores being spent by state governments. On the right hand, you have the social welfare spending. That's again about 2.7 trillion rupees, 2,70,000 crores, 1.6% of GDP. A large part of social welfare spending is also education. So it's actually, things like hostels, scholarships, schools run for SC, ST and OBC communities, etc. So this is also effectively education. So I think there's a fair bit of social spending happening. The efficacy of that I would have liked to comment on, but I don't think we have time for that. But so that is something we can debate, but I think the quantum is doing quite well. You can see some vicious cycles already. What I mean by a vicious cycle is that a poor state does not have the tax revenues to invest and therefore stays poor, right? It's a classic vicious cycle. What you see here is that in education spend as a percentage of GDP, of course, Karnataka is at 1.6, it's right at the bottom, perhaps they are already very literate, but UP and Bihar are 4 to 5% of GDP, GSDP, right? So they are already spending quite a bit on education, and yet the spend per student and the number of students we've got from DISE, so to the extent that is reliable, so we just divided the two, we got spend per student, and you see that Kerala spends almost 30,000 rupees per student per year. Bihar spends 8,000. This is despite the fact that you're spending a disproportionate part of your GDP on education. So this diversity is something which is actually very hard to break out of, and perhaps what we need now, and this Dr. Pranab Sen has been telling me that we need to look at inflation on a state basis and not at a central level. I think we may need a lot of PPP adjustment within the governments as well. Perhaps you can provide better quality education with Shiksha Mitra and cheaper teachers in Bihar than you can with more expensive people in Kerala. But these are, I think, important issues which have not been discussed. This problem exists despite what I call some systemic redistribution. So what you see is the left-hand side chart is the red dots are GSDP per capita. By now you would have seen the pattern. And expenditure to GDP, this is aggregate, not just education, is the grey bars. You can see there is again, I will not draw a causality here, but you can see a correlation that it goes in the reverse direction. So it is the weaker states which are actually spending more as a percentage of GDP, right? And this shows that there are transfers from the center and some redistribution which is happening, which is allowing them to do that. And there is another factor there. The private sector in some of these states is so small, it's only the state, it's only the government which actually can spend, which is why you see UP, the spending levels are almost nearing OECD levels, right? As a percentage of GDP, they're actually quite high. It is because the private sector is almost non-existent. Moving to pay commission and salaries. So salaries, you can see there's the red line is as a percentage of total. So you can see blips around the pay commission, and the pay commission for the state governments is still not done yet. Only about 18% or states adding up to 18% of salaries have done it so far. 3 more are plans of Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and I think Karnataka are doing it in FY19. but most of the states haven't done it so far. But you see that is not really that big an issue. Salaries being, we can always bring it down. Gujarat manages with a much lower ratio there, but I think the bigger issue is pensions. This is the right-hand side chart. This is, I think, a burden which we need to quantify as early as possible. I was part of some discussions in the FRBM review committee, and this is something that I brought up. I think it is too hard to quantify at this stage. But this is an exercise which is very important, because this number, it's already 10% of total expenditure, and I think it can be quite a bit meaningful after the pay commissions are implemented. We are far from the debt trap so far. So there has been some concern around Uday borrowing, sort of pushing the states into a debt trap. I don't think as a whole. So you can see interest as a percentage of expenditure is the lowest since 91, maybe even before that. So I'm not worried about it. Interest cost as a percentage of expenditure is a lagging indicator. By the time it starts going up, you're already in deep trouble. But the point is, at this stage, it's very hard to get worried about it. What you should get worried about is Kerala and Punjab, where salary, pension and education are actually a very large part of expenditure. So the discretion available to them is actually very small. And now how do you discipline the states? Because what you notice is that the market cannot discipline the states. So the spread, the left-hand side, the squiggly chart, is the spread between, so for every auction, so every month there are 2 auctions of state bonds. In every auction, what is the spread between the highest and the lowest for each state, for each bond? It rarely crosses 20 basis points. So the y-axis is basis points, so 0.2%. So it is not too much of a difference. And you see here, debt to GDP is the column, the SDL spread, so the state bond spread over 10-year bond. You can see there is no correlation at all, right? So the market is not going to discipline the states, and perhaps it cannot, because there is an implicit guarantee. And if you want to really go and see the Europeans, when the European Union is about to break up, at least that's what the market thinks, the yield spreads widen. The moment Macron wins, the yield spreads come down, right? So I don't think it is unnatural. So there have to be a better way of disciplining it. The budgeting process and the lack of data, and the reason why we do this, so you would wonder, it's not all the social goodwill that we're doing this for, because it gives us a 10-month headroom to the RBI's compendium. The RBI's compendium comes with a 15-month lag, by which time it is generally useless for markets analysis. Of course, for researchers it may be good. But so what we notice is that the expenditure to GDP, and the green line is the actual, is much lower than budgeted and much lower than revised. And the same holds true for deficit. So if you are working with 15-month-old data, you will get your bond issuance numbers totally wrong. And which is why getting timely or getting even the RBI to publish the compendium much faster is actually going to be very important to stop bond market distortions, especially now that state governments are so large in the fiscal space. What also happens is the central transfers are very, very volatile. What you see on the left-hand side chart is that, so this is the monthly transfers, that 42% that has to be transferred. Now, what happens is that the center decides on a certain number for the first 11 months, right? So based on their budget forecast of how much tax they're going to get, so they just say, okay, every month we're going to transfer this. And the adjustment is done in the 12th month. So what that does is, you can see that the levels, the black lines on FY, in FY 14, 15, 16, these numbers were terrible. And so it completely threw the state budgeting process for a toss. Because all the adjustment, because the center has done aggressive revenue forecasting, and assuming that they have given some transfers in the first 11 months and they adjust in the 12th month, in one of the years, in FY 15, the states got no revenue from the center in the month of March. Right? And imagine you're running a budget, a government, and you suddenly, what is actually 40-50% of your revenue, or revenue receipt, you get no money at all. Right? And that completely throws them out for a toss. And therefore, so that is something that needs to be addressed. Own tax receipts have also, they used to be pretty good at it, but in the last couple of years, we are seeing a slippage. So I think GDP growth may have been surprising them on the downside. When expenditure slips, the assumption we all make is that it is the capex which is slipping. I don't think that is the case. Well, it would be the case in some states. And here we've taken Maharashtra. You can see Maharashtra last year spent, or FY16, where we have the final numbers, spent 11% lower than they budgeted. And the slippage is surprisingly well spread out. So there is slippage happening on the welfare side and education. There are school teachers, college teachers who don't get paid. I thought it only happened in my state of Bihar, but apparently it happens in Maharashtra as well. So when they get into cash-based accounting, I mean, all the states are on cash-based accounting. If you have a revenue shortfall in the months of February and March, you say, I'm going to pay you in April, right? And that's, I don't think, a very healthy way of running a government. But the slippages can actually be spread out over many heads is the important thing. Now coming to the one-offs. So on GST, see, as we discussed, 40% of states' taxes are going to be subsumed under GST. So there's been a lot of noise around, oh my God, they're losing all their independence. But 60% is still with them, and there is a lot of taxation that they need to work harder on to get more tax out of. I mean, the kind of headlines we are seeing of some state jacking up entertainment tax to 30% and raising road taxes in some state. I think this is a knee-jerk thing, but hopefully over the next 2-3 years. And this is what happened and was seen in China as well, that over the years the states learn how to sort of tax properly. But anyways, that will happen. But the first 5 years, as you know, the compensation formula is that the center will assume a 14% revenue growth for the states and therefore compensate them accordingly. So there is some surety of revenue that the states have. I think the center has been over generous because 14% assumes, if you assume a 12% nominal GDP growth, you are assuming a 2% buoyancy, that your tax collection is growing at 2% higher than nominal GDP. But you see the red dots there, it's actually 0. So last 4 years, the tax collection of the states, of the taxes subsumed under GST, there's been pretty much no growth. No growth above nominal GDP. So I think they are getting a lot more than they would have if GST had not come. There will be a reallocation problem. Everyone has focused on CST because that is easy to quantify, the central sales tax. States like UP, Gujarat, Maharashtra have been complaining that because they are the manufacturing states, they are losing a lot more of revenue. But I think the bigger change will happen on the spread between taxable services and share of sales tax. And let me spend half a minute on that. See, what is happening under GST is that the states are now getting a share of service tax in their state. Earlier they were getting whatever was the ratio, 42% and then say 8%. So Maharashtra would be getting 3.36% of the total service tax collection. Now they will get a lot more. And what they have given up in return is a share of sales tax. If your proportion of sales tax was lower than your proportion of taxable services, which is what the case in Maharashtra, they can actually get much more revenue than they have budgeted for. So anyways, but the uncertainty is, I think, at the center because they have taken on the responsibility. Coming to loan waivers, as we discussed, I think this is a structural issue. I think farm income growth may not pick up in the coming years. We've been flagging this for the last 15-18 months that a good monsoon could actually be very bad for farming prices. And we are seeing this play out, and I think this will persist. So the farm stresses, which is what the waivers have been a response to, are not going to go away. And we'll have to see how the politicians really respond to that. Pricing growth has been very weak, and I think they will stay that way. Acreage sown even this year is quite strong. The second point is that the waivers will be spread out over many years. You will see, like in the 2008 waiver, the finance minister announced it in February. The first disbursement happened in December that year. It was completed in 4 years, right? And so it is just the complexity of implementation. Secondly, the FRBM review committee recommendation, I think there is an arithmetic inconsistency. Maybe Rathin can correct me if I'm wrong. That if you put fiscal deficit ratio as 3 and 3, if that is what the earlier thing was, and the states are still working on that, and you are starting with a 40-20 kind of split between center and state, it is simple arithmetic that over time they will converge, the ratios will converge. So having states adhere to 20% will mean that they need to bring down their deficits quite sharply to 1.7% or so, and I don't know how that will be enforced. So this is something which I think is a challenge. Coming to conclusions, and I'll quickly finish here, I know we're running out of time. The biggest conclusion, I think, is that we need to now adjust our policy framework to incorporate that states are going to be much larger. And so, we've done the 14th Finance Commission, but the follow-on regulations have not changed. And I think we need to change that. As I said, the FRBM Review Committee or target of 20% for states is inconsistent with the 3+3 fiscal deficit ratio. The challenge of disciplining the states is something that we need to wake up to, because the markets are not going to do that. And I don't think there is any regulation that the center can use so far to force them to adopt. The states need to be more creative, work harder and on getting more taxes. There is some evidence of vicious cycles. There is some questions rising on whether redistribution is enough, but I think we need to correct that. And lastly, on capex versus revenue prioritization, this policy bias that all capex is good and all revenue expenditure is bad is something that we need to revisit, and we need to look at pensions more carefully. On that note, I'll stop. Thanks.
Supposed to be the chair. Indira, would you like to go first?
Shekhar, we feel a little bereft without someone here. Do you mind coming up here? I feel the need for someone to discipline me.
You're in for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And right at the start, let me thank the authors for having sent me a hard copy of the paper. As you can see from the paper, they zap you with charts and diagrams. And when you have the hard copy sent by the authors, it has all the colors and so on. It makes it much easier to read. Thank you very much. As the author has already told us, can I switch this off?
Just flip it down.
I don't have a PPT. I could have used a blackboard or a whiteboard, but anyway, I'll do without that. As the authors have already told us, their paper is in 3 parts. There is a first section about aggregate state deficits, and then there is a second section which is about the composition, interstate variations in the composition of expenditure. And then there is a final section which I thought was the best section in the paper, which looks at GST very carefully and at the farm loan waivers. And the message of that third section, indeed the message of the whole paper really, is to soothe financial markets. It sort of says to financial markets, don't worry, it looks like things are bad, but there really isn't any cause for worry. Okay? Now, I agree with that message, but where I depart from the authors is in the reason why they reach that conclusion. Okay? I think you've missed a very, very important feature of the fiscal framework in which state governments in India function. And I'm unfortunately, since my time is limited, I'm just going to confine myself to this one point. There are other points I want to make on the paper, but I just won't have the time. So let me stay with this because I think it's so important. Okay? Let me pick up on some of the sentences that you have in the paper and some of the things you said. There has been much concern, if not alarm, in the past year on the profligacy of state governments undoing the fiscal contraction at the center. And then you say, your soothing sentence, however, the reality is less worrying. And then when you spoke, you said there's not enough of a yield spread between states, and so the markets are not going to discipline the states. And again, you say, there is this whole sense that state governments in India are functioning in a fiscal framework which is free, where the deficit is a freely determined residual. Okay? And in the order of your first section also, you begin with expenditure, then you have revenue, and then you arrive at deficits, suggesting that you go along with that essential view of the fiscal framework in which they function. The deficit is a freely determined residual. If they are profligate, then that will reflect in their deficits, right? That is what you're saying. States don't function in that kind of a fiscal framework in India. There is a constitutional provision, Article 293(3) of the Constitution, under which state borrowings on financial markets are subject to approval by the center. So any bonds that states float can only have been floated by the Reserve Bank of India, which is the issuer of public debt, if it carried the formal approval of the center. And this provision of the Constitution, which, like many provisions in our Constitution, functioned without any actual formal ratification, was made formal in 2006 by the passage of the Government Securities Act. This was one of the major contributions of Y.V. Reddy as governor of the RBI. And under that, under the standard operating procedure, the RBI simply will not issue any debt unless they have approval from the center. So anything that the states have done has had the approval of the center. That said, you can immediately come back to me and say, how was that approval operationalized? What was the formula on the basis of which it was determined? And certainly we could have a system in which, let's say, the center said to the states, I know you guys need my formal approval, but come to me with whatever you want and I'll approve whatever you want. We could have had that system, but we don't have that system. And I don't have the time to go into how you can prove from the data that that has not happened. Maybe I will have the time. 4 minutes so far, so maybe I will have the time. Okay. So the important thing then to look at is how has the center determined the borrowing entitlements of states? Now, this has varied over time. There was one configuration which held in the years going up to 2005, and I've written about that actually in an IPF paper which I presented in 2007. But I'm going to deal only with the situation after 2005, since you're not concerned with the period before that. What happened in 2005 was that the 12th Finance Commission introduced an incentive for states to enact fiscal responsibility legislation, which all but 2 states responded to immediately. And this fiscal legislation was in accordance with a common template, which targeted reduction of aggregate of their individual state deficits to 3% of state domestic product, and therefore of the aggregate also to 3% of the aggregate of state domestic product. However, because state domestic product is measured at factor cost and national GDP is measured at market prices, what this meant was that states were effectively being held to 2.5% of national GDP at market prices. So when you say here and there in the paper that the right to borrow has been split evenly between central states, that was not so, and it still isn't so. States, in fact, are being held to a cap of 2.5% of national GDP, which is 3% of their individual GDPs. If we wanted to make them, pull them up to 3% of national GDP, we would have to give them an individual limit of 3.6% of their state domestic product. Okay, that's the aggregate. But so this was the way in which it was done and has essentially been done in that manner so far. But there have been huge differences in the manner in which this provision has been operationalized between 2005-10 and between 2010 and 2015 and after 2015. Okay, and I want to go into these details, spending my scarce time on this because it's so very important. Between 2005 and 10, so before I go into that, you can easily see that when the Ministry of Finance at the center conveys its approved borrowing entitlements to the RBI, it has to convey that as an absolute, right, in rupees crores, okay? Whereas this limit, this fiscal limit is placed as a percentage of GDP. Can you immediately see that the manner in which GDP is projected is going to determine what that absolute entitlement is? Between 2005 and 10, what happened was that the Ministry of Finance simply prescribed the borrowing entitlement for every year of that 5-year period, right at the start in 2005, based on the projections of GDP by the 12th Finance Commission. So what you had over that period was that some fast-growing states like Haryana, towards the end of that period, they were being confined to a borrowing entitlement of 1% of their actual GDP. It was 3% of their projected GDP, but it wound up being 1% of their actual GDP because they had performed so well and grown so fast. And I have seen written commentary at that time by financial analysts, not you, but your colleagues in the profession, excoriating fast-growing states like Haryana for being excessively fiscally conservative. Telling them, hey guys, you don't need to be so fiscally conservative. You can afford to borrow more. But they couldn't borrow more. So can you see that very absurd, ridiculous conclusions can be drawn by looking at observed state deficits if you don't know the formula which determined that entitlement. Between the years 2010 and 2015, the 13th Finance Commission, of which I was a member, we tried to tweak the formula that is used so that the final GDP of a state in year N, as determined in year N-1, which is when the projection is done, would be a closer approximation to what was likely to be the case in year N, rather than some projection done 2 or 3 or 5 years earlier. And that did work. And that's why you do see over the period 2010 to 15 a rise in the aggregate state borrowing from what was, I think, near 1% in fiscal year 2011 to 2.5%. So the formula determines the outcome. Okay? It's madness, it's absurd to think that this is driven by fiscal conservatism or fiscal profligacy on the part of states. It's a formula-driven thing. And one more thing, in case you're interested in knowing why in the period 2005 to 10, the aggregate state deficits were so jagged, was because after the global crisis of 2008, the entitlements were loosened once again. So it goes down, then it jags up, then it jags down, and then it goes up again, okay? Now, we are now post-2015. As you've rightly shown in your figure 24, it's a good figure. If you clean out Uday, states are just a little above 2.5% of GDP. And that is accounted for by the leeway that was given by the 14th Finance Commission. So what I'm trying to show you is that when you look at state level deficits, please don't treat that as a freely determined fiscal framework. It's governed by a formula at the center. The formula has varied. Unless you look at the formula, you're liable to reach very, very wrong conclusions. There is a good point you make about the timing of issuance of state bonds, the good point. There were, if the chair will permit me, my watch says that I've crossed my time by 1 minute. Can you permit me just a minute? Yeah, okay. What have I said here? The calendar, issuance calendars. Yes. So let's get back to your message of don't worry, all is well. You say GST is not going to be so bad, farm loan waivers not going to be so bad. So you're trying to soothe financial markets, which according to you have been spooked by this rise in state issuance of bonds. Actually, I think, notwithstanding the formula is what should make the markets not worry. Okay. Because there is this constitutional provision. We are not a Brazil, we are India, and subnational governments are controlled. So that's the formula. So when you say you've done a deep dive, I'd say that you ignored the elephant in the pool, okay? Which is what's really the market should be taking solace from. That said, there are two things that are very worrying. One is, of course, the Seventh Pay Commission salaries. And the other is the march of pensions, which was happening even before the Seventh Pay Commission. So I think these are things to worry about. And worry about in what sense? Not because they will find expression in higher deficits, but because their routine expenditures are going to be badly squeezed. And you're going to find the usual thing, teachers, schools without teachers, and primary health centers without medicines and so on. Two very quick points. You use the word buoyancy in an awkward way. It's a coefficient, just like an elasticity coefficient. So one doesn't say things like 2% more buoyancy. Okay. And finally, non-tax revenues. In your figure 22 on non-tax revenues, I wanted to point out another one of these bits of very insider information. You don't get this unless you actually have a lot to do with people in ministries of finance and so on. In the period 2005-10, which was the 12th Finance Commission, you remember there was a restructuring of state debt owed to the center. You know, the way that is done in an accounting way is that it is treated as though the debt has been repaid to the center, and then there's a return flow from the center of non-tax revenue. Okay? So when you look at your figure 22, when you find that bulge between 2005 and 2010 in terms of general non-tax revenue, this is where it comes from. Okay? So you have to be very careful when you interpret these figures. I thank the chair for overlooking my lack of discipline.
Thank you, Indira. Thank you, Indira. Rathin?
Thank you. I thought this was an excellent paper, Neelkanth, and I'm very pleased that this is something that NIPFP obviously has been working on for 30 years plus, but it's been a restricted audience. We do an annual thing, it will interest you, on state finances well before the RBI. We've been doing it for the last 3 years. We're doing the next one in August, but we keep it invited because we want state finance secretaries and others who are the real clients to speak freely. But it's excellent that the markets are waking up to this next step of looking at the states collectively. Of course, as an economist, I'm worried now because now you're going to bring cross-country regressions, that terrible thing called cross-country regressions, into the domain of comparative analysis of states. So as long as you stay with general government, I'm okay. Indira ji made the main point regarding Article 293, which causes a huge problem in doing macro fiscal analyses of states, tempered somewhat by the fact that now there is a conversation after the 14th Finance Commission, which happens in the Finance Ministry, on the ways in which these limits are set. The 14th Finance Commission also allowed some flexibility based on historic record. So if you start with the 14th Finance Commission, then the endogeneity of this Article 293 becomes somewhat less of an elephant, I think. I have a few specific comments and then general observations. Specific comments. One important feature of fiscal consolidation by the states is simply that they have collectively ceased to run revenue deficits. And that didn't come out in analysis. I was surprised. Since you make a lot about the virtues of revenue expenditure, the point is not whether revenue expenditure is virtuous or not. The point is it ought to be tax financed ideally. And the center has not done it. And for reasons we have elucidated in the FRBM report, we do not expect the center to do it for another 5 or 7 years. So this is a virtue which I think needs to be taken account of. It leads to affordability in running, in increasing revenue expenditures, which complicates your analysis. So for instance, if you take the state of Uttar Pradesh, which you find, the very fact that it's not been fiscally profligate and has been running reasonable revenue surpluses over time has permitted it to increase revenue expenditures, including in education. You might want to bring that in as an important point. Why Karnataka's percentage is low? Well, a couple of things we need to control for. Many states, for example, my own state, Maharashtra, a large proportion of the education expenditure goes to what are called aided schools, simply because there's a history of aided schools. So obviously then expenditures will be lower, right? But this is an important link between the states that are actually running revenue surpluses and their capability of raising expenditures. On the calendar, I have an additional point to make, which is actually a philosophical problem we have, which is that the RBI is the banker to both the center and the states. The center has a very clear banking calendar, and if the center were to come to you guys with a bunch of loans and the states were to come to you with a bunch of loans, everyone's cost would go up. So what effectively happens is the states come second in this and the center comes first. However, to moderate that, there is something called ways and means advances. And there's a whole WMA process, I was on that committee, which is fairly accommodative in allowing states to manage their short-term cash flow needs consistent with the expenditures they want to undertake. Because you must remember that debt is only incurred because of borrowing. On the revenue side, in fact, it is actually, by the way, it's 13 tranches, not 12. There's a 13th adjustment tranche, and there are 12 tranches. The first 3 tranches, actually the center is in deficit because it's not getting any revenue. So it's actually protecting the states by providing these regular tranches. Not taking budget, the BE too seriously, that's a great idea. You shouldn't take the BE seriously. We never have. So don't take it seriously. What are you going to do instead is what I'm wondering. We have tried to do marksmanship analyses. You'll find them out there where we try and proxy differences between BE and RE and why they happen. But to save you the trouble, the drivers for these differences vary so much that there are very few stylized facts you can use to come up with a sort of corrected BE number, which might help you guys engage in the bond markets. The fact that state expenditures are going up relative to the center is actually something that we've all known. It's an arithmetic truth. Why should it not go up? The center does nothing in this country anymore, which is why I get very irritated with people who use, firstly, loosely words like counter-cyclical, and then say that the center should engage in public investment, because it has never done that. It has not done that for years. It has not done that since the 80s. The central public investment is a fraction of state public investment. Most of central public investment goes into financial investment, as you know, not into gross fixed capital formation. So it's been about 25, 30 years since the states were major players in investment. Now that they've curbed the revenue deficits, it stands to reason that they'll also be major players in revenue expenditure. If you look at central revenue expenditure, what does the center do? It does law and order, it does some defense, it runs a railway, and then it does some merchant banking. It puts some money into NIIF, leverages that 7x, right? And it makes some transfers, which, as you know, are heavily dependent on any kind of discretionary money they have. And yes, of course, they give out a bunch of subsidies. But the central government is not actually a major player in the delivery of public goods. So that cause for the state government spending to rise does not surprise me. In fact, it could be anticipated to rise even further over time as long as these fiscal parameters are maintained, particularly the zero revenue deficit. Okay. I'll make three more. Excellent. I have some time because this one point will take a little bit of time. The point that you made on the states collectively underspending on police, you need to control for that by noting the following fact, that central expenditure on paramilitary forces has gone up. It's the only department of the government of India whose expenditure has actually gone up and whose employees have actually gone up, is the Ministry of Home Affairs. Okay. And paramilitary has gone up from 300,000 to 1.1 million plus. During FRBM, Home Secretary told us that he expects it to go up by approximately to 1.5 billion over the next 15 years. So a major part of police spending in India is not about law and order and, it's not like England bobbies. It's about Naxals and counterinsurgency, movie stuff. Movie stuff is done by the center. And over a period of time, what has happened is that the reliance on paramilitary forces of the states has increased. So actually what has happened is that state police forces are less important in the law and order space than the central police forces are, and that you need to take account of. So it's not entirely true that India is under police. It's also partly that the things India polices are somewhat more tense than what regular countries with normal law and order problems police, and that need is taken care of increasingly, regrettably, by the paramilitary and the army. Actually, to be very honest with you, we've written about that. We've alluded to it in the FRBM report and in the Pay Commission report. On the Pay Commission, the states have always been extremely strategic in the why and how of implementation. And they have actually shown incredible fiscal fortitude in not increasing salaries. It is quite incredible to think that a state like West Bengal could actually not pay DA for 18 months and then pay it only partially. But it has done so. So, and again, if you read the 3-page chapter, which I frankly wrote in the Pay Commission report, we have given 9 or 10 reasons why we do not think that the Pay Commission would be a burden so much on the states, because, with some exceptions, my 3 bad boys and girls, the usual Punjab, Kerala, increasing now Maharashtra. But for the rest of them, they have well worked out strategies. We know this because they come to us and ask us how to manage these awards, so I wouldn't worry about that. I'm glad. I think the point you made about the farm loan waiver is a very important one. It's a very good point. Farm loan waivers are bad things for other reasons, but the fiscal impact on state finances, other than to scare the states, will not, I think, be of great magnitude. On the GST, just a piece of information, I'll share the research with you. I did this research earlier when Tamil Nadu was making a big noise about losing money. We found that, high production states were also high consumption states, with the exception of Gujarat, which somehow did not seem to consume anything. I mean, compared to what it ought to be consumed. I don't know what they do in Ahmedabad, maybe I can guess. But they don't consume as much as they ought to. Maybe they buy shares in things. So I don't think that the GST would be such a big concern in terms of compensation. The state, in fact, the center has deliberately budgeted for overcompensation because this 2% extra over trend was part of the big GST, not this GST, not the good and simple tax, the tax we used to talk about. the goods and services tax. In that tax, there was supposed to be a GDP dividend, a tax buoyancy dividend, and all that. So that tax was sold as such. Now, in the good and simple tax, there will be no such dividend, probably. So the centre may suffer, but otherwise, that was part of the political compact. Final point, excellent, on what you said. Neelkanth, it's in the report, page 95, we have the FD path. I don't think you'll find this, apart from in the dissent note of the chief economic advisor, on which I won't comment, you won't find anybody here saying that we expect it to be 3 and 3. In fact, we don't. We want the centre to go down to 2.5, and we worry about the fact that the states will have to go down from, you're right, in terms of GDP at market prices, from where they are now to approximately exactly what you said, 1.7. And that is happening because the states have the incremental debt burden of the states, is essentially is expressed in the form of a high primary deficit because interest payments have been falling because they've not been profligate historically. This is a problem that really worries me and continues to worry me about how we manage this. But nevertheless, what we have tried to do is say that, okay, if states make collectively just 0.16 reduction in the FD, and you give them a long time to make this reduction, then what you're actually going to see is the center falling fast, the states actually increasing slightly, and then falling to a point of rest where the debt GDP ratio will be 40-20, right? That is, 40-21. 21, not 20. And that will involve a fairly significant reduction in the aggregate fiscal deficit of states. But from your own research should show that the distribution of that, which we have left to the 15th Finance Commission to decide, in fact, hopefully on a priority basis, as with an early report, would be one in which certain states with historic debt legacy may have to have faster deficit reductions than other states. Finance Commission will decide the merits or what weight to put on that historic legacy, which is a complicated issue. It requires conversations with states. So there's no fallacy here. I'm sure you won't find a single word in this report that says 3 plus 3. That was Rangarajan back in the day. But in this report, we never said 3 plus 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Rathin. Floor is now open. I see a couple of, I'll start just from here and go around. So let's start with Rohini.
Thanks, that was very illuminating. I wanted to in some ways relate some of the discussions, especially by Professor Rajaraman, back to almost the first session where we spent quite a lot of time talking about the concerns of command and control. In some way, one way I think of these formulae is what they do is by having these blanket rules very often on how transfers will take place, they're probably going to lead to a lot of sort of distortionary agency activities by state bureaucrats or politicians or other groups in order to kind of remain at the formula and do what you want to do. I was curious, in some sense, I didn't get a sense of that from you. I mean, I got a sense certainly salaries slip. I think I agree with you, that's very important. But beyond that, what is your sense of what are the things that both states and centers are doing to account for the fact that the formula in any single year is not going to match just, whether the monsoon was too high, too low, what you actually need to do. So, and overall, I guess, should we be thinking about ways of financing that are not formula based?
Vijay?
I think my question is related to what was just said. You referred to, someone referred to the OECD and how the bond market doesn't enforce credit discipline on OECD countries.
The EU. I mentioned the EU.
Sorry, I meant the EU. Now, what's the analog to that here? Since you say it doesn't enforce credit discipline here either, and so is it enforced by the central government because there is a constitutional provision that they have to, and if so, how does that work? Does it work well enough that we can feel confident about the future? And how should it work? And what's the answer to this? If the market won't do it, what's the answer to this problem? Or is it something we don't need to worry about? So that's one question. The other question the primary deficit was mentioned here, and I think by Rathin and so forth. I was rather confused by all that You don't seem to mention the primary deficit at all. Again, is that, at least in your presentation you didn't, is that because it's not a variable of significance, or what?
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me see. Is that Suman? Is that your flag up? Yeah.
Yes, it is. Just laterally, just to because Neelkanth is in the markets. So Neelkanth, I've been thinking about the fiscal monetary mix, and this may seem a little kind of extraneous, but since Indira has been on the RBI board, perhaps it's legitimate. What I want to know is that this aggregate of state borrowing and central government borrowing, how should one be thinking about, as it were, price discovery in the presence of things like SLR, etc.? I mean, Urjit Patel, in a volume that Ken Kletzer has edited, goes, basically excoriates the system for having maintained SLR, and that monetary transmission is kind of messed up, etc. It's a little extraneous to this, but I just want to get a sense whether the bond market as a whole is playing any price discovery role, or whether this is just stuff being, jammed into receptacles that have been decided by the central government. If you could provide some insight, thanks.
Govindara?
Thank you. Let me compliment the authors for the very painstaking work because, dipping drill, and particularly when you have an elephant in the pool, is not going to be easy. So they have done it. Rathin mentioned that NIPAP has been doing it for 30 years. No, it is 40 years. Let me correct you. NIPAP has been doing very serious work on state finances for the last 40 years, and they have a fairly robust data bank. And this data bank, in order to get that data bank in place, you need to do a lot of plumbing work. And I'm not sure whether you people have done the plumbing work. Let me just point out a few of them. One is, that's one of the things which Reserve Bank of India doesn't do it.
Cleaning.
And serious people don't use the Reserve Bank data to analyze expenditures and revenues. Let me put it very, very bluntly. The important thing that you have to do is there are a number of items which are, sort of in some of the states which are given in gross terms. Lottery. You have gross, whichever is the state doing, you have lottery, revenue from lottery, expenditure lottery. And so both revenue and expenditure goes up. There are states which run departmental public enterprises, Punjab Roadways, and then they have a separate Pepsi Road Transport Corporation. And so you need to make adjustment in regard to these and to net them out. The second issue is that this is a bigger, this thing which will impact on your, which will have which will influence your conclusion. Until 2005-06, all the centrally sponsored schemes used to go to the states. From 2006 to 2014, the centrally sponsored schemes money, the money going from the center, simply went to the implementing agencies. So if you say that I will take the center's expenditure and I will take the state's expenditure and minus the centrally sponsored schemes and the grants that are given, you are really underestimating the expenditure that has gone to the implementing agencies. That is completely gone. Now, 2014 onwards, this has started, in fact, thanks to Rangarajan Committee report, the government said that the money should pass through the state budgets. Now, you need to see, you need to set this plumbing, and the plumbing is not easy. If you really want to get this thing, it's a hard task. Aggregate level, you can do it. Service-wise, there is a state like Kerala, which says that 20% of its or 25% of its planned expenditure will go to the local agencies. And the money is not shown under, education money and health money is shown under education and health. It is shown somewhere else, and it goes to the decentralized units. The similar problem exists in Karnataka. So there is a whole lot of plumbing that you need to do before you come to, for example, if you say that if you compare it from 2004, 2005 to 2014, you will say that until 2014 expenditure on many of the development services was low, and suddenly it has increased, because I think it's basically I mean, I don't know whether you people have done this plumbing work, but if you have not done it, I think you need to be cautious in drawing the conclusions. Similarly, there is a significant statement made that sharp increase in the tax devolution by the 14th Finance Commission. You should not forget the fact that earlier you had something called the Gargill formula grants, which are given by the Planning Commission. Okay, now that constituted 5.5% of this thing, and then this commission did not give any discretionary grants, including the forest grants. That is 1.5%. The comparison is between 39 and 42, if you really carefully analyze it. So, I mean, there is a lot of misinformation that is spread. This 42%. It is not, it's not 39, it is not 32 to 42, it is basically 39 to 42, if in that sense of the term. More meaningful way possibly is to classify the things into general purpose grants and specific purpose grants. After the 14th Finance Commission, you have much more clarity, because 14th Finance Commission has not given any specific purpose grants. It's only basically doing, and on the untied nature of the thing that you are talking about, there is a, yes, the untied grants to some extent went up. But what has happened? There was a committee, Niti Aayog committee, chaired by the Madhya Pradesh Chief Minister, which changed the matching formula. Earlier there were things like Narega, which were basically 20%, 30% was the state's contribution. Now suddenly everything becomes 40%. Many even in Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, it was 30%. Now it has become 40%. True that the untied portion has increased, but not as much as one really makes out to be. One has to look at those things.
Govinda, you have a lot
no,
of
I'll
comments.
just one or two.
No, so let me just say that let's actually have you send some, or write, or let's get those comments, because I want to give a turn to others, if you don't mind. Otherwise we'll run out of time. Please, if you just have a minute more.
I will only make last point. That is, on the fiscal risk. You did talk about, sort of some of the risks that are, loan waiver is the major risk. I think possibly you need to focus on implementation of prohibition as another major risk, because the states have gone about doing it. They are going about doing it. The Tamil Nadu people are saying that now they will go for prohibition. Kerala is, has already gone in, but then now they are rethinking, and then Andhra Pradesh is likely to, Telangana is likely to move in. So there is a fiscal risk involved in the prohibition policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Govinda. Mihir?
Two things. One is just a question of information, which is, what is the nature of the backup guarantee provided by the center on the state bonds? What is the nature of the actual, is there an implicit, explicit guarantee, or what is it?
It's implicit.
Okay, and has it ever been tested? In the US, we've run into that recently, so it would just be good to know what that means. Second thing is, I think I agree with Indira, which is, it's a lovely paper and it's a blizzard of things. I don't think I got the message, which is don't worry, be happy. I didn't get the narrative for why. I thought what you were going to say was expenditure has shifted to the states, taxes have shifted to the states, the balance sheet of states substituting for the balance sheet of the center, don't worry, be happy. I understand that. That's a breakdown of fiscal federalism, it's devolution, and that can make you happy, unless you, of course, you're worried about the economic heterogeneity across the states, which, as you point out, is quite pronounced. Then you don't allow the transfers that would facilitate the poorer states getting better. But of course, that's not the narrative. The narrative is expenditures has been pushed to the states, taxes have not kept up with that, transfers have been higher, considerably higher, and borrowing at the state level has been higher. So we have decoupling of taxation and expenditure, which expenditure is happening more and more at the state level. Taxation's not keeping up with that shift. So then we need some discipline. What I heard Indira say was, don't worry, be happy, because the center will police this, because we're not Brazil. I'd love to know why you think we're not Brazil. I understand the constitutional provisions might be different, but it would seem like there are lots of political economy reasons why that decoupling becomes very problematic. And then the other possibility of the discipline is the bond market discipline, which you yourself say is not happening. So I get the message, I just didn't understand the narrative about why I shouldn't worry.
Okay. Tien?
This discussion earlier did not mention
Shanta,
any
just put the
word
mic closer to you.
about the first speech of the Prime Minister on Independence Day, namely federalism of the changing the Planning Commission, and it would become not the centrally created Planning Commission as the original Planning Commission was, and the Niti Aayog is now. It's completely centrally created institution. What are we going to forget altogether? The notion India is going to be eventually a federal state, not the facade that is called Niti Aayog that we have now, or the earlier Planning Commission we had.
I couldn't hear you very clearly, but I think I think you got the question. Anybody else? Yes, one at the back, please.
Hi, I've got a similar question to what was raised earlier about how do we discipline states beyond the constitutional provision. The constitutional provision that was mentioned, the condition for how center is allowed to police states is when the states actually are lending from the center. And I think this was a point which was raised in the economic survey also last year, which is that the central share of lending to total states has been falling quite rapidly. And there is, like, if looking forward, let's say 10 years, 15 years from now, there can be a situation where some states at least do not have any lending left from the center. 7 years. And then in which case, how do you sort of start disciplining if this provision does not apply to some of the states?
Okay. Rajneesh?
I have a clarifying question on when you say the bond market doesn't impose any discipline. What are you saying? A, you could think that there is a implicit bailout by the center. In case of a default, you would actually. So this is a risk-free asset, irrespective of the level of debt. Other thing could be private placement, that you would just take the bonds and place them with government agencies and other people. Why doesn't the market impose any discipline on the bond market, even if a small fraction is traded in markets?
Even if a small fraction is traded where?
Just repeat what you just said, the last part of your sentence. We couldn't hear it here, sorry.
Even if a small fraction of the bonds are held by private investors, why wouldn't that be a signal to enforce some discipline? The rate should go up, or cost of borrowing will increase.
Got it.
Okay. Neelkanth?
Yeah.
You've got a lot of things on your plate. Please.
So let me start with what Dr. Rajaraman said, and I fully agree. I think so it is actually a backward calculation, which is why states very rarely breach that 3% limit. So it is like that. The sequencing was not designed to. I mean, perhaps you assumed that we didn't assume that the states get some revenue and so they have some expenditure and then they arrive at a deficit. I mean, I know, and which is the point I made towards the end as well, that even teacher salaries get pushed out because the states can't borrow as much. So I'm fully with you. I am not, from what I heard in some of the committee discussions earlier, not here, is that by 2024-25, Gujarat would have repaid all of its loans 26. To the center. 26, yeah. And so then the provisions under Article 293 will not apply.
Right.
And no.
Yes,
there's a discussion on whether World Bank IMF loans, World Bank ADB loans can be counted as that's you were saying, play acting. I mean, this is games.
So when you are, so I fully, but given the time frame in which some of these policy decisions get corrected, I mean, it may not be.
Sorry.
No, why don't you please?
No, go ahead, go ahead. Yeah.
So, so it is actually, I think from a, if you're just doing pure analysis, I mean, relaxing because the government is sort of has your back, is not something that, I mean, it is clearly working right now. In fact, we wanted to put in a chart there where, if you take the incidence of, say, over the last, say, 2006 onwards, the last 10 years, and then take 27, 28 states on average, out of 280 instances, I think the breaches of 3% would have been extraordinarily rare, right? And then would have happened with the permission of the center. So I mean, I'm absolutely not disagreeing with your statement that it is backed up by that. And so anyway, so that I think hopefully sort of addresses the point you raised. I think they're very important points, but we worked on that. I think the second thing on why the bond markets are not bothered, and there was a common refrain, I think, in many of the questions. I think there is a big problem with, so there is, there is the problem of SLR and the government sort of imposing its will on the market, forcing people to hold bonds. But that I think that over time, as we comply with Basel III norms, where there is a certain liquidity requirement, and therefore I think the SLR norms that the RBI has to give will actually keep declining. And so they have, even in the last policy meeting, the ratios came down, and I think in 5 to 7 years, if the direction is the same, that proportion actually will start to come down. But to the extent that right now most of the state bonds and most of the central bonds even are actually held by insurance companies and banks, and mostly actually public sector banks, is something that is actually distorts the market in more ways than just this. I mean, if you think about the bond yields on a 10-year central government bond, the linkage to the RBI's rate, which the bond market is sort of fixated on, should actually not be that high. I mean, if you see what has happened to the 10-year US, for example, the Fed has been raising rates, but the 10-year US has actually just not moved. In India, on the other hand, there is a very strong linkage there. I mean, there should be a linkage to fiscal deficits, there should be a linkage to the borrowing calendar, but
I just need to interject here. So look, as an asset pricing person, all of that stuff is irrelevant for pricing. And the reason is because those are passive holders. The question is, who is the marginal investor? So Rajneesh's point was that even if you have a tiny fraction held by the private sector, you should reflect this in the prices. So it doesn't matter whether there's an iceberg underneath there of huge amounts of passive holdings. The question is, who is the marginal investor?
Well, I take the theoretical aspect of that, but believe me, I mean, if you talk about the bondholders who are buying it, if you ask the mutual fund investor who's buying those bonds, and you ask why it is being priced in a certain way, what you will find is that the yield spreads between the SDL and the GSEC is actually driven more by liquidity than the quality of the state financials.
All you're saying is that people are expecting that there's going to be a bailout at some point.
It is. There is a very implicit government guarantee, and there's never been a default, and I don't think the government will ever test the market to a default as well.
I'll speak to this point too, but anyway, yeah.
Are you done?
No, actually, so there were, I've been sort of scribbling. So the question is, how do you discipline the states? And in fact, the last question from Dr. Srinivasan, I've been reading, or trying to read more on this whole issue of federalism. And in fact, Dr. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly deliberately changed Federation of States to Union of States. And so the union in India has the right to form and destroy states. So the true federalism, where the states are free to step out of the union or come in, is not something that I see happening anytime in the near future. It is good to give them more freedom, and I think it will show up in good ways. I'm very positive on that, but I don't think we'll get to that extreme anytime soon. So there was how do you discipline? So Dr. Reddy was explaining one day that see, this was again an issue of, and I think the FRB Review Committee also, we discussed this quite frequently, is that to a sovereign, can you impose so there was a big debate even in the Constitution, or when the Constitution was framed, should the sovereign be constrained from borrowing? So the wire media between the left-leaning folks who thought that they should have complete freedom and the Bombay Club kind of people who wanted the government to be fixed to a certain size, was that at some point FRBM self-regulatory things will be imposed, and I think those still apply to the states. It was the loan restructuring of 2005-06 which actually got the center to convince the states to pass 3% fiscal deficit legislation. And I don't think, so I unfortunately don't have an answer on how we will get them to adhere to the 20%, 21% or the FRBM review committee legislation, and how, as Rathin was mentioning, and how to sort of, because there are some states which are at nearly 30% and there are some states which are at 10, 12%. So how do you separate out the two and have separate? I have absolutely no idea on how that will happen. There are quite a few, but I think maybe over lunch we can chat.
Yeah, and I think Govinda Rao had a lot of comments, and I'd really encourage Govinda to perhaps share them. Govinda, if you're listening, just to share some of, I think, the very important points you were making, perhaps in a post-conference conversation. Indira, you had something to say, and then Rathin, and then we'll wind up quickly.
Yeah. How much time do I have? 2 minutes? 3 minutes?
Minute.
1 minute. 1 minute. Oh my goodness. I am going to request you to let me be slightly undisciplined, because this is such a very important issue. All right. Several questions were asked about the whole business of the yield spread on state bonds, right? I mean, what drives that? So, okay, and Tarun, your point is very valid. As long as there's anything at the marginal, then it's going to drive that spread. Okay, if you look at the yield spread, you'll find that in recent years it has actually widened. Okay, it has. It's probably much wider now than it has ever been. Okay, and that is precisely because of what you mentioned, because there has been more and more non-commercial bank, non-SLR participation in this. I'll also tell you very quickly that whenever you look at the SLR, you have to look in the fine print. As you know, in India, the devil is in the details. In the fine print, you'll find that along with the SLR, there is an HTM requirement. The HTM is held to maturity. Okay? And over the years, the HTM has been brought down more and more, which means that there has been more play for the market. And this is why the interstate yield has gone up. That said, let me address the key question. This really puzzles many observers of Indian financial markets. Why is the yield spread so low? Why is the market apparently willing to lend to Haryana and to Jharkhand on sort of roughly equal yields? Okay. This and the reason I requested the chair for some time, because this is an important point to remember. Another one of those little institutional wrinkles that you have in India. The RBI is the banker to the central government and to state governments. Okay? And the way it conducts the issuance of these bonds and the servicing of those bonds is that there's something called an automatic debit mechanism, ADM, whereby these bonds are first serviced before any other expenditures are entertained. Okay? This acts as a yield reducer, and it also makes these bonds essentially risk-free. You know, the question that Rajneesh was asking. Mihir, this is not because there's an implicit guarantee from the center. There's no implicit, as far as I know, there's no implicit guarantee from the center. Here I disagree with Neelkanth. There's certainly no explicit and no implicit either, and it has never been invoked or had to be invoked because of the ADM. Okay? Now, the funny thing about the ADM for Tarun and Mihir and others is that if you go to the RBI website, you'll find no place, no paper where this thing is actually said up front. It's one of those little private things that is done by the RBI in order to ensure that financial markets are smooth. So for Neelkanth and others who want to reassure financial markets, this is one of the very reassuring things that RBI does. Yeah.
Rajaraman, we mentioned that specifically in the report, that there is effectively like an escrow that is available.
It functions like an escrow.
It functions like an, so which is why the bond markets are.
Yes.
So we expressed, no, we are fully
Have you said
aware
that? I missed it.
No,
Okay.
we've written that.
Okay.
In fact, and I first heard it from you in the FRBM review committee, so I'm a learning machine.
Shekhar, could I just respond to a question raised by Rohini, who is not here? But
okay, but you are keeping people from lunch, so go ahead, please.
Are you all very hungry? You're You're hungry for knowledge, yes, okay. But where's Rohini?
As long as the audience is with us, fine.
Where's Rohini, though? I mean, she asked a very good question. Okay, please convey my answer to her, okay? She asked a very, very good question. She said, there is a formula, and we've remained at the formula, but has there been agency distortion? Okay? And I do want to answer that, because it's an important question. A very amusing thing happened when the 13th Finance Commission provision came in, whereby the GDP projections had to be updated from year to year, instead of taking a blanket 5-year projection and just doing this once and for all, closing the file for a bureaucrat's a great thing to do, and just pushing the file away. So what happened at that time was that state governments you have a situation where the GDP is being projected for year T, in year T-1, and what we asked them to do was to look at the most updated figure on the year T-2 in order to project more carefully what the GDP was likely to be in the year T. This provision was hugely resented in the Ministry of Finance because not only did they have to do more calculations every year, but state governments would come to them with vastly inflated figures of GDP for the year T-2. And as you know, GDP, even at the national level, there is an advance estimate, and then there is a first provisional estimate, and a second provisional estimate, and a final final figure, which may be very far from the initial advanced estimate. So they were going through a lot of this jacking up of the advance estimate because states wanted to get a larger borrowing entitlement. And they were able to resolve that only by saying that if they were to jack up the GDP, the next year they would be punished by having their entitlement correspondingly reduced. So that is why we managed to stay within the 2.5% in aggregate. Thank you.
Thank you. Rathin, did you have?
Just very briefly, I mean, one thing that complicates this sort of modeling is the incentives that people have to take advantage, perhaps because of history, of things that are made available to them. So for your typical state bureaucrat, if you ask them, how much would you like to borrow? The answer would be as much as I can. There is no I want to borrow for X or Y or Z. And because it's a closed game, the center then says, well, I won't let you borrow as much as you can. And that's a very good reason to have rules. Now, the problem may be in the working out of the articulation of the rule, but in a system like this, to avoid conflicts of interest, to avoid allegations that BJP states get a better deal than non-BJP states and things, it's very, very important to have rules. And I think the right place for these rules to be framed is the Finance Commission, which has indeed been what is happening. On the guarantee thing, I want to end by saying that I completely agree with Neelkanth, whether you like it or not. The markets assume that state government debt is good compared to central government debt. And I think the yield, I mean, there may be more complex reasons for it, just reflects what Neelkanth was saying, a certain comfort level that the analysis people in the back room have with doing their spreadsheets for chaps sitting in Hong Kong and New York, which they have to do despite the nature of our market, with central government debt, and the harder work they'll have to do if they go and buy equally sovereign, equally cast and guaranteed debt. But I mean, I think there's no, and I think the lack of difference in yields reflects that. Thanks.
So let me thank Neelkanth and Prateek for really what's a major effort on their part, and also one that actually does open up this issue which hasn't really been front and center. And so I'm very glad that at the IPF we've had this opportunity to put this paper across, and great thanks to both Indira and to Rathin for bringing in the expert advice and guidance that they have. This will hopefully get reflected in revisions of the paper as they will take place. With that, let me close this session. Give a round of applause to Neelkanth and Prateek.